A detective unravels an eerie mystery in a town haunted by whispers and shadowy figures, racing against time to save missing children and uncover the sinister truth hiding in the forest. What is it about this forest? Detective Ethan Raine arrived in Cold Pines just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the town. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and decay, the remnants of a summer storm pooling in the potholes lining the cracked streets. Cold Pines was the kind of place time forgot: a dilapidated gas station, a single diner, and a scattering of weather-worn houses buried under thick canopies of pine trees. The town wore its age like an old coat, heavy and tattered. Ethan had been called in after the third child vanished. The latest, a 7-year-old boy named Jamie Parson, had disappeared 2 nights ago while riding his bike home from his best friend's house. The bike had been found in a ditch, its front wheel spinning in eerie silence, but there was no sign of Jamie. No footprints. No struggle. Just the bike and a chill that settled over the town like a thick fog. The parents were frantic, and the local sheriff, a grizzled man named Carter Briggs, was desperate. 3 kids gone in 2 months. All boys. All taken under similar circumstances. Cold Pines had never been much for crime, an occasional drunken brawl at the diner or a speeding ticket on the main road. But this? This was something else. Something that gnawed at the town's collective nerves. Ethan parked his car in front of the sheriff's office, the building as rundown as everything else in Cold Pines. The sign over the door creaked in the wind, its letters faded to near illegibility. Inside, the fluorescent lighting buzzed faintly, casting a pale, sickly glow over the room. Sheriff Briggs greeted Ethan with a firm handshake and a face etched with sleepless nights. "Glad you're here," Briggs said, his voice low and gravelly. "I don't know how much more this town can take." Ethan nodded, his sharp eyes scanning the cluttered bulletin board behind Briggs. It was plastered with missing posters, the faces of the 3 boys staring back at him. Jamie Parson, with a toothy grin that spoke of innocence. Caleb Marks, 10 years old, last seen walking home from school. And Henry Lowry, an 8-year-old who had simply vanished from his backyard. "No witnesses?" Ethan asked, his voice steady and calm despite the grimness of the situation. "None," Briggs replied, shaking his head. "It's like they were plucked out of thin air. No screams. No signs of a struggle. Nothing." Ethan's gaze lingered on the photos. 3 boys, 3 sets of parents, 3 lives shattered. Something about it didn't sit right. The abductions were too clean, too calculated. Whoever was behind this knew exactly what they were doing. "I'll need to see the last place Jamie was seen," Ethan said, pulling out his notebook. "And I want to talk to the parents." Briggs hesitated, his brow furrowing. "The Parson family, they're not doing so good. You'll have to tread lightly." "I'll do what I can," Ethan replied. As he followed Briggs out into the gathering dusk, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this case was different. There was an unease in the air, a creeping dread that wrapped itself around the town like the fog rolling in from the forest. He'd seen darkness in his career, murders, kidnappings, the worst humanity had to offer. But this? This felt darker. As if the forest itself was watching, waiting. And Ethan knew one thing for certain: Cold Pines was a town with secrets. The Parson house sat at the edge of Cold Pines, a weathered structure that looked as though it had been standing long before the town was ever founded. The porch sagged under its own weight, and the yard was overgrown with weeds, the remnants of a childhood swing set swallowed by the encroaching wild. It was here, on this isolated plot, that Ethan found Jamie's parents, huddled together on the couch in their dimly lit living room. Carol Parsons' hands trembled as she held a framed photo of Jamie, her eyes red and swollen from hours of tears. Mark Parson, a stoic man with a face carved by years of hard labor, stared blankly at the floor, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles twitched. "I told him to be back before dark," Carol whispered, her voice hoarse. "He promised me he would. Jamie never broke his promises." "Mrs. Parson," Ethan said softly, his pen poised over his notebook. "I know this is hard, but I need to ask a few questions." She nodded, clutching the photo tighter. Did Jamie mention seeing anyone unusual recently? Anyone who might have approached him? Carol shook her head, her lips trembling. Mark spoke for the first time, his voice low and gravelly. Jamie wasn't the kind of kid to talk to strangers. He stuck close to his friends. He paused, then added bitterly. We thought we were safe here. Tell me about the night he went missing. Ethan pressed, his tone measured. Mark exhaled sharply. It was late. Almost 8. He'd been over at the Grayson boys' house. They play there all the time. Jamie was riding his bike back, like he's done 100 times before. His hands balled into fists. But this time, he didn't come home. Ethan jotted down the details, then asked, Did you hear anything unusual that night? See anything out of place? The Parsons exchanged a glance. Carol's voice wavered. The trees, she said. The wind in the trees. It sounded strange. Like whispering. Mark stiffened beside her, his fists tightening. She's just rattled. There was no damn whispering. But Carol's gaze bore into Ethan, a plea for him to understand. It wasn't the wind, she said firmly. It was something else. Something wrong. Ethan leaned back, the room's silence settling heavily around them. He had heard his share of strange stories in his career, parents grasping for any explanation in the face of unbearable loss. But something about Carol's words stuck with him. I'd like to see Jamie's room, Ethan said. Carol hesitated before nodding. She led him upstairs, her footsteps slow and heavy. The room was a snapshot of a happy childhood. Action figures lined the shelves, and glow-in-the-dark stars adorned the ceiling. But the bed was unmade, and Jamie's sneakers sat by the door as if waiting for him to put them on again. Ethan scanned the room, his sharp eyes catching every detail. On the desk, he noticed a drawing, hastily scribbled in crayon. It showed a group of tall, shadowy figures standing among the trees, their heads tilted unnaturally, as if they were listening. Did Jamie draw this? Ethan asked, holding up the picture. Carol's face paled. He said he saw them in the woods. She whispered. He called them the Watchers. A chill crept down Ethan's spine. He had expected monsters under the bed, childhood nightmares conjured in the dark. But this felt deliberate. Precise. He folded the drawing and slipped it into his pocket. Thank you, Mrs. Parson, he said. I'll do everything I can to bring Jamie home. As Ethan stepped outside, the wind rustled through the trees, the sound like faint murmurs just out of earshot. He glanced toward the forest bordering the property, its shadows growing deeper as night fell. The Watchers. Ethan didn't believe in fairy tales. But he did believe in patterns. And this one was just beginning to emerge. Ethan stood at the edge of the forest, the jagged silhouettes of pines rising like sentinels against the twilight sky. The cool air carried the scent of damp moss and rotting leaves, and the whisper of the wind through the branches sounded almost like words. Sheriff Briggs arrived a moment later, the crunch of his boots on gravel breaking the uneasy silence. You sure about this? Briggs asked, adjusting the flashlight in his hand. Ethan nodded, his jaw set. If Jamie came through here, there might be something, anything, to explain what happened. The sheriff sighed. Locals call these woods the Pines. Lot of folks around here don't go in. Not anymore. Why? Ethan asked. Briggs hesitated, then said, Superstition. Old stories passed down. They say the woods aren't right. He pointed to a narrow dirt path leading into the trees. That's where Jamie's bike was found. Ethan didn't reply. He clicked on his flashlight and started down the path, the beam cutting through the encroaching gloom. Briggs followed close behind, muttering under his breath. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air felt heavier, colder, and the forest seemed to close in around them. Ethan's footsteps slowed as he scanned the ground for anything unusual. About 50 yards in, the flashlight beam illuminated something in the underbrush, bright, unnatural red against the muted greens and browns. Ethan crouched and carefully lifted the object. It was a piece of fabric, torn and dirt-streaked, but unmistakably part of a child's raincoat. Jamie's? Briggs asked, his voice tight. Ethan nodded. Looks like it. He swept the beam of light further ahead. The path was faint, overgrown with weeds and brambles, but it continued deeper into the woods. Then he noticed something else, an odd pattern in the dirt, barely visible under the scattered leaves. He knelt, brushing debris aside to reveal a series of shallow indentations, like footprints. Tracks, Ethan murmured, his voice sharp. Briggs shone his flashlight over them. Too small to be an adult. Could be Jamie's. Ethan studied the prints, his mind racing. But something was off. The tracks were uneven, almost hesitant, as if Jamie had been walking, or led. Ethan, Briggs said, his voice dropping. Look at this. The sheriff's light focused on a nearby tree trunk. Carved into the bark was a crude symbol, a circle with jagged lines radiating outward, like a sun drawn by a child. Ethan ran his fingers over the grooves. The carving was fresh, the edges clean. This mean anything to you? He asked. Briggs shook his head. Never seen it before. But it doesn't look like something Jamie would do. Ethan's gut tightened. The symbol was deliberate, a message meant to be found. But by whom? A sudden noise stopped them both, a faint rustling deeper in the woods, followed by the snap of a branch. Ethan's hand instinctively went to his holstered gun as he scanned the shadows. Probably just an animal, Briggs whispered, though his tone was far from convincing. Ethan didn't respond. He took a cautious step forward, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The sound came again, this time closer, a rhythmic crunch of leaves, deliberate and steady. Who's there? Ethan called, his voice echoing. No response. The two men stood frozen, the silence around them growing heavier by the second. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. Ethan exchanged a glance with Briggs, both men on edge. We keep going, Ethan said, his voice firm. Briggs hesitated but nodded. Together, they pushed deeper into the woods, the flashlight beams darting between the trees. The forest seemed alive now, its shadows shifting and writhing like living things. Ahead, the path opened into a small clearing, the ground covered in a thick layer of pine needles. In the center stood a solitary wooden structure, old and weathered, with its roof sagging and walls leaning precariously. Ethan's flashlight illuminated the entrance, a yawning black maw that seemed to swallow the light. What the hell is this place? Briggs muttered. Ethan stepped closer, his pulse quickening. The air around the cabin was unnaturally still, the usual sounds of the forest, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, conspicuously absent. Whatever secrets these woods held, Ethan was certain they led here. Let's find out, he said, stepping toward the door. The cabin loomed before them, a decaying relic of another time. Its wooden boards, warped and splintered, were dark with rot, and a tangle of vines crawled up its sides like veins on ancient skin. The smell hit Ethan first, a pungent mix of damp wood and something sour, like decaying leaves left too long in stagnant water. Briggs hesitated at the threshold, shining his flashlight into the darkness within. You sure about this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We didn't come this far to stop now, Ethan replied, his own light cutting through the murk. The inside of the cabin was worse than the exterior. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dirt and debris, broken by jagged planks and holes that revealed the cold, dark earth below. The walls were adorned with crude carvings, symbols and shapes that matched the one they'd seen on the tree. Someone's been here recently, Ethan said, pointing to a pile of discarded items in the corner, a rusted tin can, a shredded tarp, and what looked like the remnants of a fire pit. Briggs crouched beside the fire pit, his gloved hands sifting through the ashes. Still fresh, he muttered. They couldn't have been gone more than a day. Ethan's gaze shifted to the far end of the room, where a small trapdoor was embedded in the floor. The edges were lined with deep scratches, as if something, or someone, had clawed at it. Help me with this, Ethan said, kneeling by the trapdoor. Together they pried it open, the wood creaking in protest. A rancid odor wafted up, stronger than before, and both men recoiled instinctively. Jesus! Briggs muttered, covering his nose. Ethan aimed his flashlight into the opening. A narrow staircase descended into the earth, the steps slick with moisture. The beam of light barely reached the bottom, but what it revealed was enough to send a chill down his spine. There, half buried in the dirt, were more carvings, symbols etched into the walls of the subterranean space. They were crude and uneven, as though made in haste or desperation. "Looks like some kind of cellar," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the unease crawling through him. "I'm going down." Briggs shook his head. "You're out of your damn mind. We don't know what's down there." "That's exactly why I need to find out," Ethan replied. He descended carefully, his boots slipping on the damp wood. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of decay thickened. At the bottom, the space opened into a cramped earthen room. The walls were lined with shelves, each one holding strange, disconcerting objects, broken dolls, rusted tools, and jars filled with a murky, unidentifiable liquid. Ethan's light stopped on something in the center of the room, a small pile of clothes, neatly folded. His chest tightened as he recognized the bright colors of a child's jacket, paired with sneakers too small for an adult. "Briggs," Ethan called, his voice echoing. "You need to see this." The sheriff reluctantly joined him, his larger frame struggling to fit in the confined space. His flashlight landed on the pile of clothes, and he swore under his breath. "It's Jamie's," Briggs said, his voice cracking. Ethan stepped closer, his flashlight catching something scrawled into the dirt floor. It was another symbol, larger and more intricate than the others. This one had jagged shapes radiating outward, surrounding a single word carved in jagged letters: home. "What the hell does that mean?" Briggs asked, his voice barely audible. Ethan didn't answer. His mind raced, piecing together the fragments of a puzzle that was growing more sinister with each discovery. Whoever, or whatever, had taken Jamie, they had left this message deliberately. The sound of a creaking floorboard above froze them both. "Did you hear that?" Briggs whispered, his hand going to his gun. Ethan nodded, extinguishing his flashlight. The faintest hint of movement came from the cabin above, a shuffling sound, slow and deliberate, like someone, or something, walking across the floor. They exchanged a look, silent and tense. Ethan motioned for Briggs to follow as they climbed the stairs as quietly as possible. The sheriff's breathing was shallow, his eyes wide with fear. As they emerged into the main room, the cabin was deathly silent. The only sound was the wind rattling the loose boards, but the air felt charged, electric. Ethan's flashlight swept the room, landing on the doorway. It was open. "I closed that when we came in," Briggs whispered. Ethan approached the door cautiously, his hand on the grip of his gun. He stepped out onto the porch, his flashlight slicing through the night. The forest was still, too still, as if holding its breath. And then he saw them. Just beyond the tree line, faint but unmistakable, stood the figures from Jamie's drawing. Tall, shadowy silhouettes with heads that tilted unnaturally, watching. Ethan's blood ran cold as the figures began to move, their shapes melting into the darkness. "Briggs," he said, his voice tight. "We need to go. Now." Ethan and Briggs retreated from the cabin, their movements quick but deliberate. The forest seemed to close in tighter with each step, the oppressive silence broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot. Behind them, the shadowy figures disappeared into the dark, leaving nothing but the echo of their presence. "Did you see them?" Briggs whispered, his voice trembling. Ethan didn't respond immediately. His mind churned, grappling with the implications of what they'd seen. "Something, or someone, is out here," he said finally. "And they know we are too," Briggs cursed under his breath. "We need backup. A full search party." Ethan shook his head. "Not yet. Whoever's behind this, they'll scatter the moment we bring more people in." He paused, turning to face Briggs. "But we need to move fast. I want to trace those tracks from the cabin. They might lead us somewhere." Briggs hesitated, glancing back at the woods. The tension in his face was unmistakable, but he nodded. Let's make it quick. The flashlight beams darted along the forest floor as they retraced their steps to the faint trail of footprints. The tracks wound deeper into the woods, weaving through dense underbrush and around massive, moss-covered trees. Ethan noted how erratic the prints were, sometimes close together, sometimes far apart, as though Jamie had been pulled along or struggled to keep up. About a quarter-mile in, the tracks stopped abruptly. Ethan crouched, running his fingers over the dirt. The leaves and pine needles were undisturbed beyond this point. They just end, Briggs said, scanning the area with his flashlight. That's not possible. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Unless Jamie was lifted off the ground. Briggs paled at the thought. By who? Or what? Ethan's flashlight caught something nearby, a length of twine, stretched taut between two trees and glinting faintly in the light. He followed it with his eyes, realizing it was part of a larger network, a series of threads crisscrossing through the trees like a spider's web. What the hell is this? Briggs muttered, reaching for the twine. Don't touch it! Ethan barked, grabbing Briggs's arm. Briggs froze, startled by the urgency in Ethan's voice. It's deliberate, Ethan said, pointing to the pattern. This isn't random. It's a trap, or a signal. They stepped back cautiously, surveying the strange setup. The twine stretched in intricate patterns, connecting trees at odd angles. At the center of the web was another carved symbol, this one larger and more detailed, etched into the trunk of an ancient oak. Ethan examined it closely, his breath visible in the suddenly colder air. The symbol seemed alive, its jagged lines twisting and curling in a way that made his head ache if he stared too long. This is ritualistic, he said, his voice low. Ritualistic? Briggs echoed, his unease growing. Ethan nodded. Whoever's doing this, they've planned every detail. It's meant to keep people out, or draw someone in. As they studied the symbol, a distant sound reached their ears, a faint, melodic hum, carried on the wind. It was haunting, almost like a child's voice, though the words were indistinct. Briggs's hand went to his gun. You hear that? Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. The sound grew louder, weaving through the trees, pulling them forward like a siren's call. They followed the sound to a small clearing where the forest canopy opened up, allowing a sliver of moonlight to illuminate the ground. At the center of the clearing stood an old well, its stones slick with moss and its wooden cover half rotted away. The humming stopped abruptly as they approached, replaced by an eerie silence. Ethan leaned over the edge of the well, shining his flashlight into the depths. The light barely penetrated the darkness, but he could see something glinting faintly below, something metallic. We're going to need rope, Ethan said. Briggs stared at him incredulously. You're not seriously thinking about going down there? If Jamie's down there, or if there's any clue about what happened to him, I'm not leaving until I know, Ethan replied, his tone firm. Briggs sighed, rubbing his temples. You've got guts, Raine. I'll give you that. He scanned the clearing, his flashlight catching a coil of rope discarded near the base of a tree. Looks like someone planned ahead. Ethan took the rope, securing it around the sturdy remains of the well's wooden frame. He tested the knot, then began his descent, the rough rope burning his palms as he lowered himself into the darkness. The air grew colder the farther he went, the damp walls of the well closing in around him. At the bottom, his boots landed on a soft, wet surface. The flashlight beam revealed a pool of stagnant water and a scattering of objects, bones, scraps of clothing, and an old, rusted lantern. But what caught his attention was the metallic glint he'd seen from above. He reached into the water, his fingers closing around a small pendant on a broken chain. Pulling it into the light, he saw Jamie's name engraved on the surface. Ethan's stomach twisted. This was no longer a search, it was a race against time. Above him, Briggs's voice echoed down the well. Ethan, we've got company! Ethan's blood ran cold as a shadow passed over the well's opening. Ethan looked up, gripping the pendant tightly in one hand. The faint beam of Briggs's flashlight flickered above, but it was the movement behind it that set Ethan's nerves on edge, a dark silhouette, shifting at the edge of the well's opening. Briggs! Ethan called, his voice echoing in the damp confines. What do you see? Something's out here, Briggs replied, his voice tense. I can't get a clear look. The sheriff's flashlight jerked wildly, the beams slicing through the trees as if chasing something unseen. The forest above erupted with sound, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and the faint, bone-chilling whisper of something moving quickly through the underbrush. Get ready to pull me up, Ethan said, urgency thick in his voice. Briggs didn't respond immediately. Ethan heard his footsteps crunching across the clearing, pacing. Ethan, whatever's out here, it's circling the well. Ethan's grip tightened on the rope. He couldn't see anything from his position, but the oppressive weight of being surrounded pressed down on him. Briggs, pull me up. Now! The rope went taut as Briggs began to haul him out of the well, hand over hand. The ascent was agonizingly slow, each pull accompanied by the sound of Ethan's boots scraping against the slick stone walls. The pendant swung loosely from his hand, its chains still wet with the stagnant water from below. As Ethan neared the top, he finally caught sight of Briggs. The sheriff's face was pale, his eyes darting nervously around the clearing. He stopped pulling for a moment, raising his flashlight toward the tree-ling. Briggs! Ethan barked. The sheriff snapped back to the task, but his movements were clumsier now, his strength faltering under the weight of his fear. Just as Ethan reached the edge of the well, the shadows above shifted again, and the faint outline of a figure emerged, a tall, unnaturally thin shape standing just beyond the clearing. What the? Briggs stammered, stepping back. Ethan scrambled over the edge, landing beside the sheriff. What did you see? Briggs pointed toward the tree-line, his hand shaking. There. Right there. Ethan's flashlight followed, illuminating nothing but the gnarled trunks of ancient trees. The figure was gone. Are you sure? Ethan asked, his voice low. I know what I saw, Briggs said, his tone defensive. It was watching us. Ethan scanned the clearing, his sharp eyes searching for any sign of movement. The forest had fallen silent again, but the oppressive tension remained. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the very trees were holding their breath. We need to get back to town, Briggs said, his voice cracking. This place, it's wrong. Ethan didn't argue. He tucked the pendant into his pocket, then secured the well's rotting cover as best he could. We'll come back. But for now you're right. Let's move. They retraced their steps quickly, the flashlight beams darting nervously between the trees. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made Briggs flinch, his hand hovering over the grip of his gun. Ethan remained calm outwardly, but his mind churned with questions. The pendant was proof that Jamie had been here, but why? And who, or what, had taken him? As they reached the edge of the forest, the lights of Cold Pines came into view, a faint beacon of normalcy in the otherwise suffocating darkness. They stepped onto the cracked pavement of the main road, their breathing heavy. We need to regroup, Ethan said, glancing at Briggs. Get a map of the woods, cross-check it with other reports of missing kids. There's a pattern here, and we're not seeing it yet. Briggs nodded, though his eyes were distant. And what about whatever that was out there? Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled the pendant from his pocket, holding it up to the faint light of a nearby street lamp. The engraving on its surface shimmered, and something about it tugged at his memory, a connection he couldn't quite place. I don't know what we're dealing with, Ethan admitted. But whatever it is, it's not done. As they entered the sheriff's office, the tension between them was palpable. The small, cluttered space seemed almost comforting after the oppressive weight of the forest. Ethan spread out a map of Cold Pines and its surrounding woods, marking the locations of the 3 abductions with a red pen. The points formed a rough triangle, the cabin at its center. This isn't random, Ethan muttered, tracing the lines with his finger. Whoever's doing this, they're following a plan. Briggs leaned over the map, his brow furrowed. But why? What's the endgame? Ethan's gaze shifted to the pendant in his hand. The jagged symbols carved into the cabin, the twined traps in the woods, the shadowy figures, all of it pointed to something deeper, something darker. I don't know yet, Ethan said, his voice grim. But we're going to find out. Just then, the office phone rang, its sharp tone cutting through the tense silence. Briggs picked it up, his expression darkening as he listened. When he hung up, his face was ashen. "Another kid's gone," Briggs said. The sheriff's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, processing the weight of what Briggs had just said. "Who?" Ethan asked, his voice low but urgent. "Tommy Sanders," Briggs replied. 8 years old. His mom called it in not 10 minutes ago. He never came home from school." Ethan's pulse quickened. Another child, taken in broad daylight, right under everyone's noses. Whoever was behind this wasn't just bold, they were calculating. "Where was he last seen?" Ethan asked, already grabbing his jacket. "The school," Briggs said, fumbling for his keys. "Teacher says he left with the rest of the kids at the end of the day. Nobody saw anything unusual." "Let's go," Ethan said, leading the way out of the station. As they drove through the dark streets of Cold Pines, the atmosphere felt even heavier than before. The quiet town seemed to hold its breath, every house and shadow laden with unease. The Sanders house was modest, a single-story home with a porch light that flickered weakly in the cold night air. Tommy's mother, Beth Sanders, was waiting for them at the door, her face pale and streaked with tears. "He's never late," she said, clutching a tissue in her trembling hands. "Never. He always comes straight home after school." Ethan stepped forward, his voice calm and steady. "Mrs. Sanders, I'm Detective Raine. I need you to tell me everything you can about today, anything unusual, no matter how small." Beth nodded, her voice breaking as she spoke. "He left for school this morning, same as always. I packed his lunch, gave him his coat. He was happy, excited about a project he'd been working on. The teacher called me just before dinner to ask why he didn't turn in his homework. That's when I realized." She broke off, her sobs filling the room. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're going to find him, Mrs. Sanders. I promise." He turned to Briggs. "We need to head to the school." The Cold Pines Elementary School was dark and deserted when they arrived. The only light came from a single security lamp near the entrance, casting long shadows across the empty playground. Inside, the halls were eerily silent, the smell of cleaning supplies lingering in the air. Ethan and Briggs made their way to Tommy's classroom, their footsteps echoing off the linoleum floor. The teacher, Miss Klein, was waiting for them, her face etched with worry. "Detectives," she said, her voice trembling. "I've already spoken to Sheriff Briggs, but I'll tell you everything I can. Start from the moment the school day ended," Ethan said, his notepad in hand. Miss Klein took a deep breath. The bell rang at 3 o'clock. The kids packed up their things and left. Tommy was with a group of his friends, laughing and talking, just like any other day. "I saw him walk out the front doors." "Did he say anything? Act differently?" Ethan asked. "No," Miss Klein said, shaking her head. "He seemed completely normal. Happy." Ethan frowned. "Another clean disappearance, just like the others. No witnesses, no struggle, no sign of where the child had gone." "Can we see his desk?" Ethan asked. Miss Klein nodded and led them to the back of the classroom. Tommy's desk was neat, a stack of books and a pencil case resting on top. But it was the drawing tucked under his notebook that caught Ethan's eye. He pulled it out carefully, his heart sinking as he studied it. The crayon drawing depicted a forest, tall trees, dark shadows, and the same eerie, thin figures Jamie had drawn. Miss Klein's hand flew to her mouth. "That's what he was working on," she whispered. "He wouldn't stop talking about it. He said they were watching." Ethan exchanged a grim look with Briggs. The pattern was undeniable now. The children weren't just victims, they were being targeted, drawn into something far more sinister. "What else did he say about them?" Ethan pressed. Miss Klein hesitated. "He said they come at night," she murmured. "That they called to him in his dreams." Ethan felt a chill crawl down his spine. He folded the drawing and slipped it into his pocket. "Thank you, Miss Klein." If you think of anything else, call us immediately. As they left the school, Ethan's mind raced. The drawings, the whispers, the symbols in the woods, it was all connected. But to what? We need to get back to the forest, Ethan said as they climbed into the car. Briggs groaned. Not again. Whoever's behind this is using those woods, Ethan replied. They're hiding there, or they're leading these kids somewhere. Briggs started the engine, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. And if we run into those things again? Ethan's gaze hardened. Then we figure out what they want. As they drove back toward the forest, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The children were leaving clues, crying out for help in the only ways they could. But the question remained, would they find Tommy in time? The forest was even more foreboding than before, the towering pines swaying in the cold night wind. Shadows danced across the ground, stretching and shifting in ways that seemed almost alive. Ethan and Briggs parked the car at the trailhead, the headlights barely piercing the oppressive darkness ahead. The hum of the engine faded, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling through the branches. We should wait for daylight, Briggs said, his voice betraying a mix of fear and frustration. We don't have that kind of time, Ethan replied, checking his flashlight and securing his gun. The longer we wait, the colder Tommy's trail gets. Briggs sighed but didn't argue. He grabbed his flashlight and followed Ethan into the woods, their footsteps crunching on the frost-covered path. The air grew colder as they ventured deeper, and the sounds of the town faded behind them, replaced by an eerie stillness. The trees seemed to close in, their branches forming a tangled canopy that blocked out the moonlight. Where are we heading? Briggs asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The clearing with the well, Ethan replied. If the pattern holds, there might be something there. They moved in silence for a while, their flashlight beams cutting through the gloom. Ethan's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the case. The drawings, the symbols, the figures in the woods, everything pointed to a deliberate, methodical predator. But the figures they'd seen, the whispers, those didn't fit. The trail abruptly split ahead of them, the main path veering left while a smaller, less obvious one branched off to the right. Ethan stopped, shining his light on the smaller path. This wasn't here before, he said. Briggs frowned. You think it's new? Fresh enough, Ethan replied, noting the broken twigs and trampled leaves. Someone's been through here. Without waiting for a response, Ethan turned down the smaller path. Briggs hesitated for a moment, muttering something under his breath, then followed. The path wound through the trees, growing narrower and more overgrown with each step. The air was thick, heavy, as if the forest itself were pressing down on them. Then the sound came again, the faint, melodic humming they had heard near the well. Ethan stopped in his tracks, his flashlight sweeping the shadows. You hear that? Briggs nodded, his hand hovering over his holstered gun. Yeah. It's coming from up ahead. They pressed on, the humming growing louder with each step. It was haunting, almost hypnotic, like a lullaby sung in a language Ethan couldn't place. The path opened into another clearing, smaller than the one with the well. At the center stood an old wooden cross, its surface weathered and covered in strange carvings. Surrounding it were several small piles of stones, each one meticulously arranged. But it was what lay beneath the cross that stopped them both cold. A child's shoe. Briggs knelt, his flashlight trembling in his hand. This is Tommy's, he said, his voice hollow. Ethan's jaw tightened. He scanned the clearing, his flashlight catching more strange markings carved into the trees around them. The symbols were similar to the ones at the cabin and the well, but these were more elaborate, more chaotic. This is a ritual site, Ethan said. Whoever's doing this, they're escalating. Briggs stood, his face pale. Ethan, what the hell are we dealing with? Before Ethan could answer, the humming stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. The air grew colder, and a strange tension settled over the clearing. Stay close, Ethan said, his voice steady despite the growing unease. They circled the clearing, their flashlights probing the darkness. But the feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. Then a sound broke the silence, a low, guttural growl, deep and resonant, coming from the trees beyond the cross. Ethan turned, his flashlight snapping toward the source. The beam caught a flash of movement, something tall and thin, its shape distorted by the shadows. "Briggs, back up." "Slowly," Ethan said, his hand on his gun. Briggs didn't argue this time. They moved cautiously, retreating toward the path they had come from. The growl followed them, a menacing presence just beyond the edge of the light. "Ethan," Briggs whispered, his voice trembling. "I see it," Ethan replied, his flashlight catching another glimpse of the figure. It was closer now, its movements unnaturally fluid, almost gliding through the trees. The path was just ahead, but the growl grew louder, closer, reverberating through the air. "Run!" Ethan barked. They bolted, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they sprinted down the narrow path. The growl turned into a cacophony of snapping branches and rustling leaves as the thing gave chase. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't dare look back, but he could feel it behind them, closing the distance with terrifying speed. The main trail came into view, and they burst onto it, stumbling as they tried to regain their footing. The growling stopped abruptly, and the forest fell silent once more. Ethan spun around, his gun drawn, but the path behind them was empty. "What the hell was that?" Briggs gasped, clutching his knees as he tried to catch his breath. Ethan didn't answer. He stared into the shadows, his mind racing. Whatever had chased them, it wasn't human. And it wasn't done with them yet. Back in the safety of the sheriff's office, Ethan and Briggs sat in silence, their breaths still heavy from the chase. The events in the woods replayed in Ethan's mind, the humming, the shoe beneath the cross, and the inhuman thing that had pursued them. "What the hell do we tell people?" Briggs finally asked, his voice cracking. "That there's some kind of monster out there?" Ethan shook his head. "We don't tell them anything. Not yet. Whoever's behind this wants us scared. If we lose focus, we lose everything." Briggs sighed, running a hand over his face. "So what now?" Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pulled out the crayon drawings they'd collected, the forest, the shadowy figures, the symbols. There was a pattern here, but the pieces refused to fit together. As he studied the drawings, the office phone rang, cutting through the tense silence. Briggs flinched, then picked it up. "Sheriff Briggs," he said. Ethan watched as Briggs's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing. "Slow down. Who is this?" A pause, then. "You're sure?" "All right. Stay where you are." He hung up and turned to Ethan. "We've got a witness." Ethan stood. "Who?" "Old Man Riley," Briggs replied. "Lives out near the edge of town. Says he saw something in the woods tonight." Ethan grabbed his coat. "Let's go." Riley's house was a crumbling relic at the end of a dirt road, its windows boarded up and its porch sagging under the weight of neglect. The yard was littered with rusted machinery and piles of scrap, the remnants of a life lived in isolation. Briggs knocked on the door, and it creaked open moments later. Riley stood in the doorway, a frail man with deep lines etched into his face and eyes that darted nervously. "You're the ones who saw it too, ain't you?" Riley asked, his voice trembling. Ethan nodded. "We need to know what you saw." Riley stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. The inside of the house was as cluttered as the yard, but Ethan's attention was drawn to the large hunting rifle propped against the wall. "I've lived here 40 years, Riley began, settling into a tattered armchair. "Seen a lot of strange things in those woods. But tonight was different." "What did you see?" Ethan asked, pulling out his notebook. Riley hesitated, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. "It was tall," he said finally. "Too tall. And thin, like a shadow come to life. I saw it moving through the trees fast, like it wasn't even touching the ground." Ethan exchanged a glance with Briggs, his suspicions confirmed. "Did it see you?" Ethan pressed. Riley nodded slowly. "I think so. It stopped, turned its head, like it was listening. I thought I was a goner, but then it just disappeared." Did you notice anything else? Ethan asked. Symbols, sounds, anything unusual? Riley's eyes darted toward the window. There was this sound, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Like singing, but not human. It was wrong. Made my skin crawl. Ethan leaned forward. Have you seen anything like this before? Riley hesitated, his cigarette trembling in his fingers. Not this. But I've heard the stories. The old-timers used to talk about something in those woods. Called it the Whisperer. Said it only came out when the forest wanted blood. Briggs muttered a curse under his breath. Ethan stayed silent, letting Riley's words sink in. You think it's got that boy, don't you? Riley asked, his voice tinged with guilt. We don't know, Ethan replied. But we're going to find out. Riley nodded solemnly. You be careful, detective. That thing out there, it's not natural. As they drove back to the station, the weight of Riley's story pressed down on them. The description matched what they'd seen, but the implications were harder to grasp. The Whisperer, Briggs muttered, shaking his head. You think it's real? Ethan stared out the window, his jaw tight. I think someone wants us to believe it is. What do you mean? Everything about this case, the symbols, the humming, the figures in the woods, it's all designed to keep people out. To scare them. But this isn't about folklore or monsters. It's about control. Briggs frowned. So you think this is, what? Some kind of game? Ethan shook his head. Not a game. A ritual. Whoever's behind this is following a plan, and those kids are part of it. As they pulled into the station, Ethan's phone buzzed. He checked the screen and saw a text from an unknown number. They're waiting. Come alone. Attached was a single image, the clearing with the cross. Ethan's blood ran cold. They know we're getting close, he said, showing Briggs the message. Briggs's face hardened. You're not going alone. I don't have a choice, Ethan replied. If they've got Tommy, this might be our only chance to get him back. Briggs opened his mouth to argue, but Ethan cut him off. You stay here. If I'm not back in an hour, bring everything you've got. Briggs reluctantly nodded. Be careful, Ethan. Ethan pocketed his phone, his mind steeling for what lay ahead. He was walking into a trap, but if it meant saving Tommy, he didn't care. As he drove toward the forest, the weight of the message settled over him. They're waiting. Ethan stepped into the forest alone, the weight of the unknown pressing heavily on him. The flashlight in his hand barely penetrated the darkness, its beam swallowed by the oppressive shadows. The whisper of the wind through the trees was eerily absent now, leaving an unnatural stillness in its wake. His footsteps were deliberate, each crunch of leaves and twigs echoing louder than it should have. Ahead, the faint glimmer of the clearing came into view, the wooden cross at its center illuminated by the pale glow of the moon. As Ethan entered the clearing, the humming began again, low and melodic, a haunting lullaby that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. He scanned the shadows, his flashlight catching glimpses of movement, tall, thin figures shifting just beyond the edge of the trees. Tommy! Ethan called, his voice cutting through the eerie melody. The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so thick it felt suffocating. Then, a voice emerged from the shadows, deep and resonant. You came. Ethan turned toward the sound, his flashlight landing on a figure stepping into the clearing. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by a hood. Symbols were carved into the flesh of his hands, raw and bleeding, the same jagged shapes Ethan had seen on the trees and the cross. Where's the boy? Ethan demanded, his gun drawn and steady. The man didn't flinch. He gestured to the base of the cross, where a small, huddled figure lay motionless. Tommy. Ethan's heart raced. Let him go. The man tilted his head, his movements slow and deliberate. You don't understand, detective. The boy is not ours to take. He is theirs. Theirs? Ethan asked, his grip tightening on his gun. The man extended his arms, the carved symbols glistening with fresh blood. The Watchers. The forest belongs to them. The children, they are offerings, to keep the balance. Ethan's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the case. The symbols, the figures, the children, all of it pointed to a cult, using fear and folklore to mask their actions. "You're the one taking them," Ethan said, his voice cold. "Not some forest spirits. You're a coward hiding behind a myth." The man smiled faintly, his teeth gleaming in the moonlight. "You've seen them, haven't you? The shadows? The whispers? Do you really think this is all me?" Before Ethan could respond, the humming began again, louder this time, resonating through the clearing. The figures at the edge of the trees stepped forward, their forms impossibly tall and distorted, their movements unnervingly fluid. Ethan aimed his gun, but the man raised a hand. "It won't help," he said. "The forest has already claimed you." The ground beneath Ethan's feet seemed to shift, the air growing heavier. He fought to keep his focus, his flashlight flickering as the figures advanced. "I'm not leaving without the boy," Ethan growled, stepping toward the cross. The man's smile faded. "Then you've made your choice." The humming reached a deafening crescendo as the figures surged forward, their forms twisting and merging with the shadows. Ethan fired, the gunshots cracking through the night, but the bullets seemed to pass through them like smoke. He reached the cross, grabbing Tommy's limp form and pulling him into his arms. The boy was unconscious but breathing, his small chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. Ethan turned to retreat, but the figures closed.
Thanks for listening. Subscribe, like, and don't miss the next scary stories. Bye-bye.